3, 2, 1. So not quite the meteoric rise we'd predicted last week, Lewis. We didn't get 4 infinite views on that video.
We're expecting a little bit more than the outcome, but I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm not disappointed.
No, neither am I. I wasn't expecting anything, to be honest, at the start, so the fact that we're getting even any views. We also got a comment last week. I mean, it was a spam bot comment, but we did get one, so progress nevertheless.
That's right, and we think we actually got 2 comments from that bot, so clearly they're a fan.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to kind of point out at this stage, though, that we want these conversations to keep going after the podcast ends. So if people are engaging with the content, listening to the conversations, if they have an opinion, if they have maybe a bit of research or a bit of evidence that could perhaps aid us in coming to our conclusion or change our mind or correct us in some way for something that we've said wrong during the episode, we'd be encouraged to please listen to the full conversation and then put that comment in the YouTube video at the end of the episode.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And ideally, we'd get back to you and maybe in future videos be able to reply to some of these comments. And I like Scott said, we do want to learn more and continue the conversation from these episodes.
Yeah, so maybe in the future, if we do get these comments, we can address them in the following week's episode. Maybe come to a better conclusion or better understand how to deal with these situations.
Mm-hmm.
So if you didn't know, this is Guide to the 21st Century, a conversational podcast between 2 friends, Lewis and I, who discuss topical issues and try to navigate the minefield that is life in the 21st century.
Yep, that's right. So Scott and I, each week, we'll go away and we'll think about a topic and do a little bit of research, and we'll bring that to the episode, and we'll each half of the episode, we'll approach our topic, disseminate our views to each other, and hopefully reach some sort of conclusion.
Yeah, so jumping right into it this week, we've realised that we're starting to do a little bit of a theme for the first few episodes. It's probably just because they're topical for this year and for previous years. So there seems to be quite a lot of topics on like social justice, specifically on people like the backlash for being gay and trans, and how we should be acting around this. So my topic kind of carries on again from that this week. And I think it's fair to say if you've listened to the other conversations, or if you even know us as people, you and I are very pro-trans here. We're all for live and let live, the freedom of choosing to be who you want to be,
sure,
doing whatever it is you want to do. Your private and personal happiness is your right. You can choose to do whatever you want to do as long as you're not hurting anybody else. Do whatever you want.
It's your right to maximise.
Yes, exactly. But the podcast is also set up to promote discussions surrounding these areas. So, and like everything else, the issue about trans people, while we agree that they should have rights, trans rights are human rights, there are nuances to the discussions that are going on. For example, the legislation in government and things like that.
Sure.
So it's not just a sort of one-way street and how this should happen. It's a sort of, it's a new area that people are only recently sort of delving into and trying to discuss and figure out themselves. So one of the things that I've seen this week is quite a lot of Twitter threads and discussions, or two in particular, 2 threads that I've seen on Twitter that deal with the treatment of children that have gender dysphoria. So that would be children that either don't think they're the gender that they grow up in, mm-hmm, or don't identify with a gender, or are gender fluid in some way. Whatever the child feels in comparison to the way their body is. The discussion is ongoing about, or the Twitter threads would have you believe that the discussion has been concluded,
right, that
these children should be able to receive hormone blockers. So the 2 discussions that I seen were specifically about, there was some legislation that was passed, I think in Arkansas, that was against giving children, that were prepubescent children, hormone blockers because they weren't sure of the outcome, and they weren't sure of how that would affect the child's body or how it would affect them psychologically.
Right.
And there was another thread from a parent of a trans child, or a child who had gender dysphoria, who identified as something other than what their body was or what they were born as. And the parent was basically advocating for these hormone blockers. Now, in the threads that I read, the people who were stating that this should be allowed were acting as if the treatments were reversible. So they were basically put across as, these are treatments that won't permanently affect the child's body, so it should be allowed to happen. So obviously there are treatments for being, if you want to have a sex change, for example, there are treatments for that are irreversible.
Right.
What these people are talking about is reversible treatments, things that your child can do that can maybe help them psychologically, that maybe benefit them and their mental health, but would be reversible. So I didn't know anything about that.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. I've never heard of that as well.
So neither had I, and we vaguely touched on the first week because I think you and I were of the opinion, or we were of the thought process that there was no treatment like that. If as of a few weeks ago, I thought that there was no treatment in terms of like hormone blockers or medication that would be reversible. I was kind of thinking that there would be nothing that you could do that wouldn't mess about with something that was sort of naturally going on in your body. That was what I thought, at least.
Well, yeah, I'm curious to hear what you're defining as reversible here.
I think when I would say reversible, and what I think these Twitter threads mean when they say reversible, is something. So hormone blockers, in the way that they describe it, are just things that postpone puberty. It kind of holds it off. It almost like stops it for a time period.
Okay.
Until later on. So it's like medication that you can take that won't have any permanent, long-lasting effect on your body. Now, the threads were saying this. They were talking about these reversible treatments, but there were also, obviously, we spoke about in the first episode, the backlash to things like this. There were trolls in the comments. But if you dived into the comments, there were also, there were some reasonable responses that were expressing concern. I seen that there was a doctor that responded to one of the tweets, and he went through a list of issues with it and stuff like that. I didn't do verification on every single person that was tweeting back, but I took into account all the considerations. Now, one of the main concerns that came up was that studies have actually been done to show that these things can actually affect things like bone density.
That's exactly what I was actually going to mention.
So that was one of the concerns in the comments. Now, so straight away I'm thinking, okay, there's obviously conflicting research out there, because the person that was advocating for the hormone blockers was also quoting a doctor who was advocating for the use of these things.
Exactly, yeah.
So basically I kind of want to discuss, is this something that should be allowed? Is this something that the government should be allowed? And to what extent can a child decide its own responsibility, like its own fate? Because if you ask a child what it wants for dinner, he's gonna tell you it wants like Smarties.
Yeah, fucking no. Yeah, I've absolutely no idea. They get ice cream every night. Sure.
Exactly. So children obviously can't have entire responsibility of what happens to them, because they're not responsible people. So there's got to be a line drawn there somewhere.
Yes.
But before we even jump into any of that, first of all, I wondered what your thoughts were on children that display gender dysphoria. How should we deal with that, and what should we be doing with these children to address that issue?
Okay, this is really fascinating topic. I know I've used the word issue here, and I just want to clarify that when we see issue, we don't mean this is wrong. Like the body dysmorphia is not an issue in terms of this is a problem, like a plague that's affecting people. We mean this is an issue because it's a complex scenario that kind of presents us with these problems. For instance, the age at which you want to start applying blockers, or whether you want to apply them or not, or whether children have the responsibility. Going back to the first question, to clarify, that the first question was whether just the general idea of giving the children responsibility. Is that right?
No. Well, first of all, I just want to know your thoughts on how we should be dealing with children that have this gender dysphoria. That's
exactly right. So, I have read before that there's this possible problem with introducing children to these issues too early, because the idea is that, kind of what we briefly mentioned there, is that children, they are not mentally developed enough to have, for instance, like long-term decision making. The children are not equipped for that. So, and in terms of in terms of how we deal with this issue and how we go about applying these, I think there has to be like a reasonable minimum age at which we can hold off. It's just illegal. We just don't allow this to happen because children are so young. I don't think we can deal with that. I think for up to a certain age, I don't know, I can't speak with this in any authority, but it makes sense to me that we just let children freely explore sexuality. We don't even need to use terms like sexuality. You can like whatever you like. You can dress however you dress, but we have to draw a line at physical changes to your body. We'll probably start talking about again what exactly we mean by reversible there, because I have some speculation on that. But for me, like, there has to be what's wrong with just holding off a few years, right? Like what's I guess the benefit of starting at the age of 8 or something like that is that you'll have a much more successful transition.
Sure. Yeah, I think that is the main argument for it. The main argument is that if you hold off until puberty begins, or you hold off until after that, and the child will develop these sort of for example, the development of like an Adam's apple and stuff like that. There are elements of development that once you go past them, it then has a negative effect on that person's sort of well-being, because they feel a certain way, but now they are a different way, and it's sort of like permanent now, and it's more difficult to deal with. So I guess that's the argument. But coming back to your point about, yes, I feel like we should let children freely explore all of these things. Like, I don't even think there's a reason to tell a child what trans is, or what gay is, or anything like that. Like, at the end of the day, these are children. They're not. Are they even aware of these things? Yes, they're aware. So if a child was to approach you and to ask you about someone being trans, you can say, this person, well, they're born like this and they feel like this, and then maybe the child says to you, well, I feel the same way, and you're like, well, okay.
Good for you.
And you can discuss that with the child, and you can make sure that they understand that that's normal.
Yeah.
And you can make sure that the child feels supported, and they get to explore whatever it is they're going to explore.
Sure.
And then just let them do that. They're so impressionable at an early age that surely you just have to, let them explore these things and see how it plays out, There's no reason to tell a child that it is a certain way if the child is telling you that it feels a different way.
Right. Yeah, that I totally agree with you. I think it makes so much sense to push them towards just being whoever they want to be. But yeah, I think there has to be an awareness that we are talking about. Like we said, these are children at the end of the day. They can feel one thing one day and feel another thing another day. And we have to remember as well how impressionable children are. See if a child says to their parents, I'm gay, and their parents start showering flowers over them and celebrating it. The child's going to want to keep being gay. It's because I think there has to be an aspect of that, social pressure as well as pressure from parents in order to conform to this label. Being not straight, I think we especially in the UK, as much as we always talk about how there's so much discrimination, there's also in certain societies a lot of praise, for being the being brave enough to do that. I mean, I have sure, yeah, exactly, and I'm people's parents, oh, I've got a gay son, they're check me out type of thing, and the suburban fucking Britain type of thing. So there's a trap that you can get caught in, I think, where these children, they can end up being railroaded potentially.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think we're getting better as a society at this, in terms of removing the stigma of the whole thing. I know someone that I know personally quite closely came out as gay, maybe I think about a year and a half ago now, and not making a big deal about it is the issue. I remember when he told me he was gay, 5 minutes before, I think we were both drunk at the time, and I asked him if he wanted to play some Mario Kart on the Wii, because we were just drunk, we were hammered in the kitchen. He told me that he was gay, and I was like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Do you still want to play Mario Kart though? Because that was important to me at the time. Not making a big deal of it, making it just a normal thing. So if a kid tells you that, and be like, yeah, well, if you are that, that's okay. It's a normal thing, and I think we are getting better at that. It's not so much a big deal anymore. Sure. Which is good.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. I think when it comes to these kids who are like, we're talking like even before they're actually discovering sexuality here, like before the hormones in either case start kicking in and you start feeling attraction. Like I don't think kids that are like below 10, as much as they'll say like I like girls, I like boys, I don't think that's the same as a teenager saying I like girls and I like boys, right? It's because
I think puberty is probably the point where that starts becoming a factor, right?
Right,
Sex,
right, exactly.
like not actually the sex that you are, but
like gratification.
actual sex.
Sure, yeah. So like it's something that like I think we should let kids be aware of and stuff like that, but can't expect them to possibly understand what they're talking about at that age. It's like
they don't have to.
No. That's exactly right. But it's when there does seem to be. I appreciate the catch-22 that like particularly like parents have. It's because you'd be aware like if your child is really young and they have identified as trans and for the last couple of weeks they've been wanting to like they've been saying to like your son's been saying to you I want to wear a dress type of thing. I can understand the obligation from a parent's perspective that they want them to be the happiest they can be. And there's like, this is what I was meaning like the catch-22. It's because on one hand you can start hormone blockers early and ideally have a transition which is more successful, and I guess theoretically that person would grow up to more readily identify with the body they've grown into. So like there's I understand the pros.
There's obvious upsides.
Sure,
yes.
Exactly. But like the cons are that if they change their mind, then this is for them it will feel like a form of mutilation, right? It has to, because it's a horrible concept, just because we're thinking about one thing that's positive, but at the same time, depending on someone's perspective, it could be so horrifically negative. Like there's this woman in America. And I'm going to look her up later and put her and I put her name in the description of the video. But she basically was an advocate for being against transitioning gays, because she was born a woman and she started hormone therapy. It was pretty young. It wasn't like 8 or anything like that, but it was early teens. And by the time that she was like in her early 20s, she was like extremely depressed, and she just realized that she still wasn't in the right body. She'd made the wrong decision. She was actually, she reckons, gay. But she was still attracted to women, but not that this is the wrong body for her, but she has like facial hair, she has an Adam's apple, and she just says that her life basically became horrible. So like there are serious ramifications for if we make that decision early and it's wrong. And the thing is that we're dealing with a kid and we just don't know whether it's going to be right or wrong. So how do you take that risk,
Yeah. So first of all, when we talk about these hormone blockers, the immediate concern I have, because it's a medical treatment, the immediate concern I have isn't whether or not people want it, it's whether or not this is actually safe to give people, because that's what you do with like medical breakthroughs. We've just seen recently with the coronavirus vaccine, it goes through rigorous testing,
right,
to ensure that it is safe before it goes out into these atmospheres. Now, the treatment for gender dysphoria, and there is treatment, and I'm on the NHS website just now, which I've done a bit of research on recently, and it talks about treatment for children and young people. Now, there's quite an extensive section on getting the child sort of clinical psychologist help, so talking to the children, making sure that this is exactly what they want, making sure they know what they're talking about, making sure that they are sort of coherent in their thoughts, and this isn't just like a phase or anything like that. There's quite strict like therapy that children need to go through in order to get to this. There's a whole list. There's a couple of clinics in England, one in London, one in Leeds, and they have to go to, and eventually they actually have to get a court order to allow hormone blocking to even happen in the first place.
Is there a minimum age in the UK? Can does that say?
It just says that hormone blockers must start before the age of 16 on the website here. I don't know if there's a minimum age. I'm just trying to see. I'm not entirely sure if there's a minimum age. I'd imagine there will be.
Yeah, exactly.
But it just has to happen before the age of 16.
Otherwise, otherwise the hormones are they're in the system, right? You can't block something that's already happened. That's when you
Yes.
start taking substitutes. You start taking either estrogen or testosterone.
Yeah. So when we're talking about these hormone blockers, we talk about having to give them before the age of 16. Now, the NHS website also explicitly says on it, it is also not known whether hormone blockers affect the development of the teenage brain or children's bones. Side effects may also include hot flushes, fatigue, and mood alterations. So it basically says on the website, like, this is a treatment, but it also explicitly says on the website, it is not known how this affects
Right.
children,
Yeah.
which is one of the concerns I have with these people on Twitter that are telling you these are reversible changes, because I would imagine that hormone blockers are like fairly new treatment. This is like a
Right.
new area of like social science that we're kind of going into. Like the idea of someone being trans and transitioning is not entirely new, but I think that when we're talking about giving treatment to children, that's a fairly new development in the sort of cycle of how the world is handling
Right.
this.
Well, it's not just social science. This is we're talking about biological engineering here. We're messing with body chemistries and brain chemistry. Like the thing about being reversible, what immediately occurred to me was I can understand that you could start administering, or like you could delay the onset of puberty and it will eventually happen, but the ramifications of doing that in a 13-year-old body versus an 18-year-old body has to be pretty big. I don't understand how, like, that's not the same scenario, and the human bodies are so complex that we can't just expect to delay something by 5 years. 5 of the most developmentally important years of a human being's life. See, after the age of 25, you don't really change, you just age. But before then, that's when the changes are happening, the crazy stuff that's changing. I don't possibly, like, to me, I'm not a biologist. I've got higher in biology, so I know nothing about biology. But that seems,
Yes.
yeah, it seems obvious to me that you would have serious ramifications of whenever you start playing around with things. Like, we don't understand the human brain. This is like a well-known fact. There's like, we understand what things do, and we can understand if you poke that section, that finger twitches. If you poke that bit, they lose their long-term memory. But in terms of how memories are like formed, like the brain is still considered one of the most complex things to our existence. We've like solved gravity and black holes, but we don't know how the brain works. Why would we start messing around with this?
Yeah, I agree, and I'm not a biologist either, so I can't say with absolute certainty. But if your body is trying to go through that process, if it's trying to go through puberty at a certain age, it must be doing that for a reason, right? It must be, producing these hormones and inducing these changes for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like to mess around with that, like delay that, there might be some changes there that are irreversible. Like when it said reversible, I was like, well, that's very interesting. If there is reversible treatments out there, then
Sure, that's fine.
and they were completely reversible, as in this has like no long term
Yeah.
effects. I can't imagine a treatment having like no effects whatsoever.
Yeah. There has to be
But
some
like,
nausea there.
but if it was like reversible in the sense that these people seem to think it is, then I don't think anyone would be disagreeing with the fact that you can do this.
Yeah.
But when I look at the NHS UK website and it talks about blockers, and it's almost like a disclaimer. It's like, we do not know how this is going to affect your child. Like,
Right.
we it's not known whether this affects the development of their brain or their bones. And it's like,
That's the thing that I think about. It's like we're so we have this like catch-22 where you want to try and make them happy in the long term by making them feel as comfortable as they are in their own body. That's the goal, but the risk is completely unknown, and we're playing around with biological processes that have existed for nearly 2 million years. Well, I guess that's, I don't, 2 million years might be a lot long, but at least 500,000 years. Extremely.
it's clear to everyone you don't know what you're talking about with this.
That's exactly right. But yeah, that's kind of. I don't understand why. Like, in all areas of science, we don't give people heart treatments because we think it'll do something good. You know, we have to have pretty rigorous evidence. And especially we're talking about something, and especially the fact that we're talking about kids here. The kids is like the most protected group out of everyone in the UK, and we're talking about taking risks. Like, I think in the previous episode we mentioned the fact that many trans people, like it's a well known phenomenon that trans people experience much higher rates of suicide, right? And that's and on the surface of it, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think most people, when they think about that statistic, they think about the discrimination that trans people face. But I don't know. I kind of feel that the numbers don't quite match up with the amount of suicides. Like it's an epidemic, the amount of suicides that happens for trans people. It's absolutely horrific, and part of me kind of has to feel like that this process is more than just people calling them bad names. You know, like people are horrible everywhere.
That must be a factor in it. But
Definitely.
There must also be an issue of they're going through these, the changes of puberty, and it's a much more horrific process for them.
I think it has to. What we're talking about here, literally like the two hormones that control how you grow, they must have a huge effect on your mental health, right? And I can imagine the actual transitionary period must be mental. I can only imagine. And then like the period after that as well, I imagine there's so many difficulties with this process, and I can't claim to deconvolve the difference between the discrimination against trans people as opposed to the mental health side effects of the surgeries that they go through. But to me, it's always felt that we're dealing with a science that we really don't understand here. And I think that there might be actually might be like repercussions of this staring us in the face already that we're maybe not acknowledging.
Yeah, one factor that I think you probably don't see a lot of when it comes to the suicide rate, you see or at least you hear about the effects of discrimination, and I'm sure that is a massive factor in the suicide rate. I'm sure that does increase the suicide rate by a fair amount, a noticeable amount. But if you also think about I remember how difficult I found puberty, and my body was just going through these changes that I thought it should be going through.
Right.
I can't even imagine what it would have been like to go through those changes and to also think that my body was doing it wrong.
Right.
To feel like I was going through all these changes and they were actually wrong. Like to be experiencing this struggle and to be feeling like it was a wrong struggle, like it was one that I should not be going through. That must also have a huge factor on the suicide rate. That must be noticeable as well.
What you're describing there almost advocates hormone blockers in that case. It's because I totally get where you're coming from, and that
There's
was
certainly a strong argument for them if they were reversible.
Sure. Oh no, yeah, I agree with you. Like when you mentioned it at the very start, the immediate thought was that like fucking hell, if there is a reversible thing where this, everyone should have a wee shot, just to see what life is in the other shoes. Like this would be something that just enlighten absolutely everyone. But I cannot fathom, and I'm pretty sure like that has to be just a stupid Twitter viral post or something like that. Like there's no fucking way.
There was two of them. The two that I seen were sort of fairly similar. Now, when I was looking at this and when I seen this disclaimer on the NHS website, I was thinking to myself, well, this is fairly like new science. It seems like they're dealing with, and it seems like the NHS don't have the conclusion yet.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to get the conclusion, they would have to give kids hormone blockers.
Right, exactly. That's just extremely unethical.
So, well, isn't that what every medical treatment is ever at the beginning?
But I guess that's. I guess there's a problem right now in medicine, in that certain things cannot be researched because it's just considered unethical, and it's kind of funny. It's because we've decided that hormone blockers are ethical, right? Because we're still, as much as we're not doing it at like a really young age, these are still children. Like if 16 is the latest age, it'd be fair to presume, as I said, we don't actually have the number right hand, but it'd be fair to presume that 13 to 16-year-olds are going through this process already, right? That's like many, many years before you're considered an adult. It's many years before you have a fully developed brain, but we are.
But it is several years into the process of puberty. I would think it's 16.
16 is the latest. That's the cutoff for when this happens. You know, I'm assuming that there has to be a couple years before. It's not like, well, I don't know. We're kind of speculating on something we don't exactly understand here, like, because I don't know the window in which you're recommended to go into this process. But it's fucking young, you know.
Yeah, I'm thinking in order to get things like this like approved, there's got to be a bunch of like clinical red tape to get like through to get these treatments in place.
Mm-hmm.
So if the NHS have this treatment on their website, but they're also like, it's not known whether hormone blockers affect the development of your child's brain or bones,
Mm-hmm.
they must have some research to suggest that it's good, right? There must be some research out there to suggest that this is a good treatment because they are doing it.
My as I said, I've like I've like looked into this a little bit in the past before, and the one thing that I immediately was aware of is that when it comes to such a highly politicized issue, which is like hormone blockers, because that it has become political.
Yes, I think so. Right?
You really can find papers which say both things. You know, like because the end of the day is that everyone has a bias, and the reality is that in academia, there are people that you will have a certain view when you start your research, and you'll get your findings, and whether you realize it or not, you will sway the numbers to agree with your initial hypothesis. Like it's how academia works. At the end of the day, you get funding knowing that you'll get a certain result, otherwise you wouldn't fund them in the first place, right? So
one of the things that also concerns me about these threads, and these threads are from Americans, you know, and they always are from Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the parent who was advocating for the use of hormone blockers on his own child
Mm-hmm.
was quoting an American doctor. Now, immediately I'm skeptical of doctors from America, and even the doctor that was advocating against him in the comments, he was American as well. And I'm skeptical of those purely because medicine is privatized in America.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, it's because they will be buying in hormone blockers, you know, or they will be advocating different practices. At the end of the day, the unfortunate truth is that in America, their entire healthcare industry is run on maximizing profits, and I can certainly, I mean, it makes sense to me. If you want to sell hormone blockers, you have to agree with their practice, right?
Yeah, so that was the reason that I jumped onto the NHS website, because we have universal healthcare over here. So I thought, they're not making any money, the NHS, off of giving you this treatment.
Certainly not.
So in theory, it should just be unbiased information on which treatment you should receive.
In theory. Mm-hmm.
In theory. So that was why I came here, and it's given a bunch of good effects. It's given a bunch of hoops that you have to jump through in order to get them, and they are extensive. You have to then get a court order in order to get these hormone blockers, and then you will get them. But then it also says it's not known how these will affect your child in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to prove that they would be good in the long term, and you know, it might be the case that hormone blockers affect the development of your child, but maybe that development might be a net positive. You know, if your child is experiencing extreme gender dysphoria, it might be the case that, you know, these do have side effects in terms of, you know, your bone density is a little bit less. Maybe you have like health effects down the line.
Mm-hmm.
But what if the net gain is worth it? What if the mental health repercussions are so good? Or what if the side effects are so, you know, negligible, basically, that these are actually good? You know, that is a possible outcome of this research. You know, so
yeah,
I'm advocating for the research. Like, in order to say these are a good treatment, we have to have the facts and the research to back that up. But in order to do that, we have to guinea pig children. You know, we have to eventually start like human trials. And although, I mean, it seems like these are already happening. You know, children are already receiving hormone blockers, so there will be research being done on these children. But we're not going to know whether this is reversible or not for 50 years, 60 years, until these children are fully formed adults and we can see them throughout their lives, you know?
Right. I see exactly what you mean. The thing is as well, that even if we were to do this, I think there's like a real possibility that the results, if they don't coincide with what people want them to say, I think there's always a chance that they are dismissed. Like, I remember, once again, this is another source I'll need to go and put in the description, just because I've seen this fucking years ago and I can't remember a damn thing about it. That was basically a surgery that practiced in America, and they basically encouraged kind of what we were talking about at the start of the video, which is like completely abstaining from hormone blockers until like later years in life. And basically the doctor that worked there, he was very much really pro into focusing on your happiness levels, you know. So instead of addressing your gender, he tries to have, it was called like a more holistic approach. So he tried to approach like your family life, your education, and just talk about your mental state, and try and basically put the child into a more comfortable environment. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was more than 50%. I think it was quite a lot more than 50% of the children that he started practicing on when they were really young, by the time they were like out of their teens, had transitioned away from being trans, and they either identified as gay or they actually went all the way back to straight. So and that's where this point came from, was that doctor's practice was actually he's now no longer able to legally practice in America, because the conclusions that he drew and the results of the findings that he believed he studied were identified as being transphobic. So he's no longer allowed to practice. That doctor I'm talking to you about. I wish I could have found the link before we talked about this. But so that's basically my concern, is that this is a political issue, and unfortunately, when political issues get involved, we oftentimes disregard the science and go with the feelings. Maybe we do have ideas of long-term effects of this, but we're like just not comfortable addressing them yet. Maybe we're not in a climate where like the realities of this type of procedure aren't ready to be addressed. And I totally agree with you. I think we should have these testing, and also I would feel much more comfortable we had testing in the UK, exactly like you said, because then I would feel to a larger degree than in America anyway, that the findings were at least impartial.
Yeah, it's an interesting study that you're talking about, and I would like to look that up after we finish here. But
yeah, I've written it down.
What you're saying there about children going through these sort of like stages, looking through their family and stuff like that, that's actually in the NHS website. So at the top, when I told you they had to go through all these sort of processes to get to hormone blockers, so it says your child has to go through, it has to be seen by a multidisciplinary team at the institute, including a child psychologist, child psychotherapist, child and adolescent psychiatrist, family therapist, social worker. So that there are all of these like levels of, you know, you have to talk to someone, we have to identify what you're feeling, and we have to pinpoint the exact nature of what it is you're experiencing. So it does seem like the UK kind of has this. But when I'm talking about guinea pigging children, in order to understand how these hormone blockers will affect children in the long term, we're going to have to do like human trials eventually. You know, children are going to have to receive, if we want to gather that data, there is going to have to be human children trials, you know, in order for us to understand it. And it seems like that's already going on, because it is a treatment on the website. So it seems like in some instances that is actually happening. But we're not going to know the effects of these trials for 50 years, 60 years.
Yeah,
you know, until
exactly
these are complete. So it's going to be a long, long time before we fully understand these things. But in order to do it, we are going to have to give children hormone blockers, which seems like it could be risky.
Yeah, it's one of those classic ones. Oops, sorry.
It seems like it's going to come down to, you know, these Twitter threads in America. It's like, you know, advocating for giving hormone blockers to children. It's almost coming down to, do you feel comfortable guinea pigging your child into this trial in order to risk them feeling happier in the long run? That's the risk that you're taking into account here.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, it's like, do you, you know, I don't know what's worse. You know, what would be worse than going through this medical procedure and realizing that you were wrong, or going through this medical procedure too late and realizing you're not quite where you wanted to get. You know, these are incredibly difficult things to balance, and like in terms of like how this ties in with suicide rate, I'm sure there must be a connection there. It's really really complex. Yeah, I don't know. For me personally, I think what we kind of discussed is this like holistic approach of identifying, truly getting like a psychological profile of this child, and determining whether it is genuine gender dysphoria.
Yep.
That seems brilliant, you know. And I know that places in America they don't do that, but
That seems essential
it does.
to me.
It does. It seems like anything other than that is just truly negligent, or like, so you're risking the child. You're risking the life of a child here. There's not even an adult. They don't have the responsibility to make this decision, and it would be so like that. That's kind of what I was thinking earlier. Like we're like living in this scenario, and there's like this potential that 50 years from now we'll look back at like the noughties and the teens and like the 2020s and think back to myself like, fucking hell, what a bunch of cowboys, you know. Like they had absolutely no idea what they were doing. They were just pushing ahead with these areas of science because they felt that this was the correct thing to do. They did not have the research, and like you said, like we don't know what the effects of like the trans population will be in 50 years from now. And the good, oh, I guess it's good news, like the end of the day, these surgeries, sorry, not surgeries, these blockers are happening right now. You know, this is an active treatment that is being administered in America and in NHS. So we'll find out one way or another. We'll be able to look back and look at either just like just choices about like general happiness. You know, like are you happy with the transition we made? Do you wish you'd made it earlier? Would you have wanted your parents to push you through these things?
Yeah.
Have you had regrets? This is like probably relatively basic information, but years from now that's going to be so invaluable in terms of how we recommend this.
Well, the concern there is then if these studies are being suppressed at the fear of being transphobic, like that seems, you know, yeah, at that point you're then arguing with unreasonable.
Yeah.
You know, you're arguing with we have to know this information. You know, if you want to, like in America, if you don't go through all these sort of discussions, if you don't go through all these, you know, family therapy stuff like that, speaking to psychiatrists, if you don't go through these things, you only increase the risk of your child receiving hormone blockers and having never actually needed them or wanted them. In reality, you've got a 12-year-old child who is as impressionable as they come, who's heard that this thing exists, thinks that's what they are, and like just hasn't got a clue. Like, I can't even imagine. Like, I wouldn't have wanted. Obviously, I'm not trans, but I can't imagine having the responsibility thrust to me at like 10, 12 years old to like decide who I wanted to be when I was 25. You know, that seems completely unreasonable to me. But if they are to go through these sort of hurdles, if you will, of speaking to family therapists, speaking to psychiatrists, of speaking to all these specialists, and it is, you know, identified that this child has gender dysphoria, then it seems like people are going through with these hormone blocker treatments, whether or not these are reversible. They're going through with them, and we're only going to find out in 50 years' time.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Conversation that needs to happen, but yeah, the kind of doubt we're throwing in there about whether what would even do with that information, like for so many people, the result, I don't know. It could. It's kind of like doomsayerry, but you know, it's one of those things. It's like I'd hate for us to find out that it's too late, and then like require like reforms and stuff like that of how we currently deal with this therapy. I don't know. I think it's genuinely fascinating. It's because it's such cutting edge science, like actual, but engineering the way that the human beings think. You know, it's kind of like that. I think it's almost like the fledgling start of the field in years to come. The will become much more sophisticated with how we're able to play around with things like hormones and stuff like that. So we might, maybe this is just like the stumbling blocks before we have an entire enlightenment about how we deal with concepts such as awareness and consciousness and the human brain. Maybe it will become totally malleable. You know, maybe like the idea of I don't know. Maybe I'm going a bit too far here, but like I'm thinking about it and I'm about to say it out loud. But I'm like if we keep developing our understanding of how to play with the human body, then what's to stop us just making people happy? Eventually we'll get a really good understanding of how the brain works. We'll have a really good understanding of how hormones work, and we wouldn't need to worry about the ramifications of the things we do. We can just give a pill, Yeah, that's probably slightly conspiracy theory there at the end.
I mean, maybe, but I think we appreciate that the idea behind these treatments is good, and in a perfect world, we would know 100% of the people that are trans, we would know 100% of the people who require this treatment in order to become happier. The problem is that children are so flippant, and they bounce from one thing to another. They pick something up, they put it down, they're this one day, they're this thing the next. Their minds change so quickly, and they're so impressionable to the world around them that I think there's no other choice than you have to go through these like stages of discussions, of going through psychiatrists, because at that age, especially because we don't know whether or not these are reversible by this NHS website, we don't know if these are going to affect your child's brain or your child's bones. We have to be as certain as we possibly can be that this is the correct treatment for your child. If you're going to do this, you need to be as certain as you can be, and I guess try and be as certain as early as possible as well. If you think your child has this, like, maybe you should contact your GP, you should contact a specialist, someone that your child can speak to, because the chances are you're not an expert in this.
Right.
Chances are you won't be able to Google your way through it.
Your child's probably not an expert.
Your child definitely isn't an expert. Your child doesn't got a fucking clue what they're talking about. But they may have gender dysphoria, and you need to identify that, and
support
it has to
really
be exactly. At the end of the day, it's about support. And you and I have gone. We've spoke a lot about how we are pro these rights. We're pro people being happy and choosing. We just, when it comes to children, man, we just have to be careful, because it seems like we don't know if this is going to affect them.
Right.
And it might not. It might be reversible. We don't know that. We have to do the research, and then as that research is complete, it has to be published and not suppressed in any way. And we also have to be certain that this is what your child has if you are going to go down the avenue of hormone blockers.
Sure. And probably one last final note, I think, because it is kind of, I think we have the possibility of making this issue sound worse than it maybe is, because, see, to be honest with you, I know we live in the UK and it's not quite as like polarized in either direction as America, but I've not met one person ever that's thought giving hormone blockers to their child was a good idea. I don't like it's not. When I see these things on Twitter and stuff like that, I often scratch my head. It's because, to me, it's just not a reasonable thought for people to have. And according to like the NHS website, which is a well considered medical institution, they don't seem to think so either.
Yeah, I think this is another one of those things where when I was talking about like horseshoe politics or like extreme, people have gone like so far to the extreme in this direction that when someone says, "Oh, your kid's trans, what are you going to do about it?" You just go treatment. You just go hormone blockers, and then the people that are around you kind of turn around and are like, well, "Hold on a minute, that might affect your child. Like, how do you know that?" And they're just like, "Yes, if you say no, you're transphobic," and people are like, "Well, actually, there's a conversation to be had here, and we know there is. So we're actually now going towards the centre again. We're going towards the reasonable centre, whereas you can kind of scream these things, but it seems like incorrectly. I think going around and stating that these treatments are reversible when the NHS is telling you that it doesn't know if it is or not is bold, to say the least.
Sure. I would go as far as to say dangerous to spread that type of rhetoric out there.
Aye. To just straight up in a tweet that doesn't have a link.
Sure.
That doesn't have, I think the very first tweet had like a link, and that was the doctor in America, which, first of all, I told you I'm skeptical about.
Sure.
But
yeah,
it was like, I don't know, man. You can't just run around saying this is reversible when this is not like an established field of science.
No,
and it may never be.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, exactly.
That's the thing.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. This is so young, and for God's sake, people, don't take everything you read on Facebook the absolute fact. For God's sake, as if it wasn't obvious enough, you know.
If we take anything from this conversation today, it's don't believe what your auntie tells you on Facebook.
Sure, yeah. Yeah. That's 400,000 likes. That must be pretty solid. Fucking
Yeah.
way.
So that's what I've seen this week.
Interesting.
And to be fair, I think this conversation has actually maybe swayed me more towards it. Actually.
Yeah. I've definitely kind of got more of an awareness of the pros, and I can understand like putting myself in a situation of like the father of a trans child, or at least a child that's telling you they're trans, like how the decision could be not so simple, you know.
I think, you know, just support first of all, make them feel normal.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, get in contact with a specialist. You know, find a doctor. You know, get someone that your child can talk to, who can maybe figure things out with them. And then if these specialists are all coming to the same conclusion that your child has gender dysphoria, then yes, consider hormone blockers. Maybe that is the route to go for you. You know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. That makes so much sense that it almost you question why it's not that way everywhere. But
well, that's the idea of the show, right? The idea of the show is that we have these situations, and we first we don't know what we're doing with them, and then two people from like different perspectives, or sometimes the same perspective, kind of come to a reasonable consensus. That's what we're trying to do here. So, Topic's absolutely done that, and it's
mission accomplished.
Let's back it up.
Yeah, cash it in YouTube. Yeah. So I guess if that's us talking about that this week, I can transition on into my topic.
Smoothly.
So what I want to talk about this week is actually concerning the BBC, and specifically how the BBC, they basically have their how they afford to function, and that's through, in the UK, that's through the TV license, right? So for the American audience out there, I guess I'm going to give a big background on, first of all, what the hell the BBC is, what's the license, and why am I talking about it? Because this could be considered a niche subject. So the BBC is pretty like well-renowned broadcasting studio that's known across the world. People might not realise how large it really is. It's because people just know about BBC One and the news, and that's kind of understandable. But the thing to realise is that it's a really, really big company. It has like 26,000 employees. It has 10 TV channels in the UK. It has over 60 radio stations, so massive. And
so it started off as was it British Broadcasting Channel or something like that? It was
yeah,
like the first.
That's what it still stands for. Yeah. So back in 1922 was when the BBC was first established.
Wow.
Yeah, this is incredible. So it's going on 100 years. You know. Which is mental. So there'll probably be celebrations for that.
Big celebrations, isn't
Yeah, exactly. I'll look forward to it. But they decided really, really early on, well, actually at their foundation, that they were going to use a payment model where they would charge a license to users in order to use their product. The alternative in this scenario would have been using advertisements or political backing or tax cuts, you know. And the idea from day one has been to provide an impartial source of news and education, right?
Yeah, so in essence it is a subscription. It's if you can imagine having a subscription on Twitch where you have like somebody that you view, you pay for a subscription, you no longer see ads,
right.
You just see content. That's the idea.
That's kind of the idea, but that kind of like brings me on to what we're mainly going to be talking about here, is because in the UK, you don't just pay your TV license to get access to BBC. You pay the TV license to get access to TV, and that pays for the BBC. And if you don't pay it, you go to court and pay £1,000 and you'll be criminalised.
Yes, it's live television, right? The TV license allows you to watch live television.
So you can have a television and use it with your computer and use it with your PS4 and use it to stream things, as long as it's not BBC iPlayer, and that'll be fine. But as soon as you start watching like Freeview or Sky or any of these live TV services, you need to, in the UK, you legally have to pay your television license, and that's £160 a year. So £13-14 a month or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's, when you think about it, I think that what I immediately think to myself, that's not an unreasonable deal, right? You know, you're getting like 10 TV channels a fair amount of
Dunno,
content.
have you seen some of the shit on the BBC?
Well, that is kind of the kind of probably a problem that we'll touch upon. But basically, the reason I'm talking about this, and I think it's quite interesting, is because for the last around about 6 months, our current government, which is like a Conservative government run by Boris Johnson, they have been speculating on changing how TV licenses work. They actually want to decriminalise it. Well, at least that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to decriminalise it, and the idea being that the BBC would then have to come up with an entirely new scheme of how they make money, because, well, the idea is that once you decriminalise it, probably less people will end up paying for it, because people don't want to spend money they can save.
Sure.
So
I can get behind that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of reasons why people would want to get behind that idea. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is because the government basically, that law that they've been trying to think about decriminalising the BBC, just about 2 weeks ago, they've actually said that, we've actually ran out of time and we don't have the infrastructure set up to do any alternative. So what's actually going to happen is that this current licensing fee structure is going to continue for the next 5 years. These things work on like long-term tenures and stuff like that, and you can't just change the pricing scheme for a private company, because it's worth considering this conversation that the BBC is private. They're privately owned. Well, I say privately owned, they're like owned by shareholders, but they do obviously have very close ties to the government. So to sum that all up, basically I want to talk about, first off, what we think about the idea of having a TV license and the kind of consequences of this being a kind of a criminal act. It's because immediately to me, when someone describes the concept of a TV license to me, at first I go exactly where you go. I'm like, it's basically a subscription service, right? Like it's no different from that. But I think about the fact that in order to watch Sky TV, in order to watch Sky News or watch Sky Sports, you need to pay the BBC, right? Which just seems so totally archaic. Like, this law was set up when there was 3 TV channels, and BBC was 2 of them. So it kind of made sense that you're paying this, that at the end of the day you paid for this fee and it just went straight towards the BBC. And I think, like, in today's climate, I just don't see how that's possibly fair anymore. Like, it seems archaic to me. And the fact that you wouldn't get Netflix that says to you, if you don't pay for the subscription, you're going to jail, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Immediately what's coming to my mind is that it does seem a bit dated. Now, I've lived on my own. I've lived at my mum's, and I've lived on my own, and now I live at my dad's. And both my mother's and my father's, they've had the TV license, they've had live TV. However, when I lived on my own, I moved in with my flatmate at uni, and we made the decision not to get a TV license because we didn't want it. We didn't watch TV. If we did do anything like that, it was Netflix. It was some sort of subscription service that we watched something on. It was on demand, basically. Or I played my PlayStation. There was no live TV that was going on. I think we watched Game of Thrones, but we even watched that on demand on Sky Atlantic. It was like on demand. I had an account, so we didn't watch any live television whatsoever. So we didn't get it. And my feeling is that as people are growing up in this generation, it's becoming less and less necessary. As things like Netflix and Amazon Prime and things like that, services like that, are becoming subscription services, and they're releasing their own TV shows. And Netflix has so much content on it now. You don't need a TV license. BBC One is full of utter shit.
Nonsense.
The programming on that channel is garbage, and the only people that watch it, well, I think it's garbage. Obviously, there are people out there that like it. The people that watch BBC One, I think, are like older generations. It's like 50 plus now, the age of people that watch the BBC.
That's
so
right.
I can understand why the government would want to change the law, because in 20 years, no one's going to want to fucking pay that money because they're not using it.
That's exactly the point. Yeah, like throughout time in the BBC, I totally agree with you. Like, I also actually don't have a BBC license. I think I bought it like the first year that I left the flat, and that was just to watch like one David Attenborough series. So it was an expensive fucking series, and I decided after that it probably wasn't worth it again. But yeah, I agree with you. This is something that the BBC are actually aware of, the fact that typically what's happened up until like literally about the last 5 years, is that the young people, they start off watching like BBC Three, and as they get older, they move up all the way to BBC One, and like as they're around about 50 years old, they start watching the main channel, and you'll tend to find that the content that's catered on that is more catered for you. But that was really in a climate where there wasn't anything like the sheer variety we have available right now. And like, not only the variety, the high production shows. I remember people used to argue the fact that the BBC, they were basically able to produce really high budget, cutting edge, risky shows, and that's because at the end of the day they didn't have to satiate advertisers, because they're getting their money from the taxpayers. At the end of the day, they don't need to, they almost aren't, they almost operate out with a competitive market, right? It's because they have the same money every single year. It's because they don't get money from people watching BBC shows. They get money from TV, so they don't have that pressure on them. So the idea was
they know their budget.
Yeah, they have a very good idea of it. And by the way, it's $2 billion a year. Well, actually,
I wouldn't even get out of bed in the morning for that.
Pocket change for you. Guide to the 21st century. You should see the size of my bank account.
There's so many revenue streams.
That's it. So yeah, I agree that this is this kind of archaic thing, and it just doesn't fit the modern day. And there's almost this disconnect between the younger audience and the older audience, and that was the point I was reaching towards there, was that typically when you're younger, you start off watching like the more child or young adult orientated BBC channels, and as you grow older, you move into the older ones. But what's happening is that the younger generation are just more and more just dropping the platform altogether. They're not moving towards the higher shows, and the BBC is kind of already aware of that, and it seems to me that they are catering their shows to the audience they already have. For instance, one of the examples of where I felt BBC was like truly out of touch was back in 2016. They decided to remove BBC Three from the air. And for people that aren't aware, BBC Three was traditionally the channel that they put on shows for the younger generation. So it had like Family Guy on at night and like American Dad and pish like that. And but like it did have some quite well regarded shows. It's because like Fleabag.
I would say young adults.
There. Yeah, it is young adults. Sure.
Young adults. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not children, because that's like that's there are also BBC channels like CBeebies and CBBC, which are specifically oriented towards kids. But so BBC Three, they decided to take it off live television because the idea was that they weren't getting, that audience wasn't catered to. Like they're spending more money than they were making at the end of the day, and it wasn't worth the investment. So they decided to move that all onto online. And basically what happened is that like the viewership just between like 2016 and 2019 is like, it's just more or less plummeted. I've got I'll start talking about this document later on in the video, but basically, yeah, we saw that the representation really dropped, and there was like futile attempts to try and make it back, and one of those ones was by introducing RuPaul's Drag Race UK edition to BBC Three, and like all over the website there was like tons and tons of ads for it, and it was like a blatant push to try and get the younger generation reinvigorated into the series. But the problem was, like, they were still catering to the live view audience. Like, the show came out at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday. You know, it wasn't like it was just there ready to watch. It was like, it was such a confused, archaic way of functioning, and it seems to me they're just like they're really not catching on to young people today. So I guess in terms of like whether we should have the TV license or not, the a part of me just feels like fuck the BBC. You know, like I don't use enough of it. But I didn't just want this video to be like slagging the BBC, and there's also like I have like a lot of I actually have a lot of good things to say about the BBC as well. You know, for one thing is that we're talking about the TV, BBC One as the TV, and which is absolute fucking shite, you know, absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
I think you and I
it.
can, but the thing is, you know, like, we're slagging it sitting in this video, but like lots of people love it, you know, and it is like tends to be older people, and that's fair enough. You like Strictly, you can fucking watch it, but I'm not going to watch it with you.
Yeah.
But the thing that we're thinking, because that we see BBC One, that's how we're exposed to BBC, but there's like as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a huge amount of content to BBC. For instance, like the news, it's like apparently 78% of people in the UK use BBC News as a source still, right? So it's like it's highly it has a huge bit of reach with the UK audience, and also just an external audience all across the world. And this kind of comes down to the fact that, one, it's like got such a legacy to it, but two, that what I talked about at the very beginning was there's this like core tenet to the BBC that is they want to practice impartially. They want to provide an impartial source of news, and that has kind of always been in my mind. I've always seen this as an opportunity for like a global, not a global, an international platform for the left and the right to be represented on a show. And I think I think like America needs something like that. You know, like they have like Fox News, where it's like four people talking about how good Trump is, and then Huffington Post, four people talking about how bad Trump is. Like, there's no conversation here, right?
No, I think in America they just want your money, so they just need your viewership for your ads. I just clicked on, just out of interest, I know we spoke about how the BBC News is a massive portion of how the people in Britain receive their news. I just googled the website there and I clicked on it, and there's not a single ad on the page.
Right.
Just for reference. I just wanted to check to see if the no ad policy spread to the website, and it in fact does.
Yeah.
So we can assume that the money, the TV license money, is also paying for the internet.
It is. It pays for every service that the BBC has, because as much as we're talking about radio and TV shows, it applies to absolutely. Like, see, BBC Bite Size, you know, which is an educational platform to teach children. That is also part of the BBC. So like, I actually have a huge, I think BBC is actually really, really quite important in some ways, in the fact that it is this kind of neutral platform, and as so actually, I've got written down here somewhere the main goals. Here we go. Here are the public purposes of the BBC. Public purpose number 1 is to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage in the world around them. So basically just to provide an open, unbiased, unpartisan source of news, which can only be brilliant. All we talk about on this show is how we try to get people to express different forms of opinion. You know, I think that's brilliant just in itself.
And in theory, that's a great tenet to run by.
In theory, yeah, we'll get to whether I think they actually do stick to that. A second one is to
spoilers.
Support...
We don't.
Well, we'll see. A second public purpose is to support people learning across all ages, and I think I don't know about you, but like there's for the viewers at home, there's this website. It's called BBC Bite Size. It's basically like a government website which has like all the syllabus that you cover in like your high school and your primary school, and like for pretty much every single course I took at higher, I used BBC Bite Size. You know,
I was exactly the same. My weeks of revision before my exams were spent on BBC Bite Size.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, so it's like it's something that up until the creation of this video, I hadn't thought about, but it's like that's such a if your TV license goes towards funding a platform that's as beneficial to my own education as that, and it's undoubtedly part of the reason why I'm here right now. Like, it's because these things are supplemental to what you're provided by the school. It's like it's just truly brilliant, and I did not even realise that my money was going towards that. So that's another tick to me. Providing information that's unbiased, brilliant. Learning across all ages, brilliant. And like for older, this could almost be like a topic in itself. But like in terms of educating the older audience, David Attenborough, the saint that he is, you know,
not even just the older audience.
Everyone, man.
You know,
sure.
Everyone watches David Attenborough. I'm actually one of the unique people that doesn't watch his shows because I'm not that interested in them. But he teaches a lot of people a lot of things.
Yeah. Oh no, I actually think he's a god among men. You know, I think I have so much respect for him. Like the life that man has lived is just so absolutely epic, and the pioneering he's done throughout decades about the awareness of the planet we're on is just mind-shattering to me. So in terms of like awareness and like having him as an advocate for our place in the world, I think BBC does such a brilliant job at that. Again, purpose number 3 though is to show the most creative, high quality and most distinct output and services. I can't watch BBC on the TV and think that it's creative or that it's distinct or that it's
No.
in any way out there. Actually, this is where I have a bit of a problem with the BBC, which probably moves us on to a nice con after talking about the pros of the education and the unpartisan views, which we'll return to. So we pay for this bill each every year, and we have to pay for it, otherwise we go to jail. And it's literally producing shit like Strictly Come Dancing and like Peaky Blinders. It's like, see, if you ask me, why would taxpayers' money go towards shows like that? Right? I can understand education, I can understand news, because these are providing a public service. Can you argue to me that producing daytime TV and like nighttime TV shows is a public service? Should we be charging £160 a year for that?
Does the tenant specifically say that the output will be on television?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's referring to all platforms. Basically, be creative, be innovative. But
I think when it comes to news and when it comes to like the websites, I think we can say yes. Actually, personally, when I'm at work, when I was in the office, if I go around at lunchtime and I look at what people are looking at, every guy in my office is watching BBC Sport. They're all watching highlights of the football team they support on BBC. So in terms of like the stuff that they provide on the website, that's probably the best. BBC Bite Size, also a great tool if you're going through high school.
Amazing
and you
content.
just need to sit your exams. Great content. I would say every so often BBC has a great series. I think Peaky Blinders is actually a good example of one that is a fantastic series.
I've not actually seen it, to be honest.
No, neither have I. I haven't actually seen Peaky Blinders either. But from what I've heard, it's unbelievable. I tried to watch the first episode once and didn't manage to watch it for whatever reason, I can't remember. But I've heard that's a really good show. So I think that every so often there is a really good show on the BBC, but they don't hit it out of the park with them all.
Sure, yeah, that's kind of the point that I would probably make about this public purpose number 3, to be creative, highest quality and most distinct. There's certainly arguments to be made that the BBC does occasionally produce very critically acclaimed shows, and like they are, and also like we're talking about like the news and like stuff like that, and these public service that are like informational, but there has to be an argument for cultural representation, as well as cultural just improvements. Like the people don't go to the theatre as much these days, and as much as I think a lot of people have this concept of theatre being as like haughty-taughty type of thing, like I genuinely believe there's arguments to be made for culture and appreciation of art, appreciation for literature. I think it makes more rounded people, and I think it leads to people being more insightful. So in terms
I don't think you won't get many arguments on that, I don't think.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think I imagine these days part of the reason that theatre is not nearly as popular is also the price. It's because theatre art is absolutely extortionate to go there. So like the BBC is almost like supplementing this experience by producing these shows, which is actually something that I do agree with. Like the reality TV stuff is something that I just can't abide by, but I'll agree with you that they do have critically acclaimed points to make. And finally, just so we can get through a list, public purpose number 4 is to reflect, represent, and serve the diverse communities of all the UK nations and regions. So basically, to represent the people within the company, represent their, whether it's like nationality, their race, their ideologies, their sex, their anything like that. One of their public purposes is to represent Britain, and I think when you think about it, that has to be considered here, because this is called the British Broadcast Company, and it's so entwined with British culture that there has to be an awareness of the people in the country and the representations of the culture that we have in the output there.
Yeah, I think it answers that quite well at BBC. Whenever we watch the news or anything like that, the newscaster team is always, there's representation across the board there. There's always female broadcasters. There's always people of colour. There's all of these things. It has RuPaul's Drag Race on now. It's one of their flagship shows. It's
right.
It does that fairly well at BBC on the things that I watch anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you. We like, the thing is, we're giving our opinion as white Scots. So obviously we won't be quite highly attuned to different people. Like we might not be aware of the lack of disability that's been shown in the BBC, for instance. But sure, I tend to agree with you. I think the BBC does quite a good job of representing British culture as a whole, and there are like lots of pushes towards moving in that direction of trying to be more inclusive. But to kind of bring it back round off of that point, I want to pivot from public purpose number 4, which was showing diversity and representing the UK, back onto the public purpose number 1, sorry, which was being unbiased. Because I'm sure lots of people that have done research into the BBC about whether they're biased or not, that you'll often find it's because I started doing this research and like so many people quoted the same phrase, was that the BBC is great for diversity of self, so like religion, race, sexuality, but very bad at diversity of thought, which is pretty interesting because I don't know about you, I read BBC News. That's actually it's only the news source I actually read. I don't really go into any other websites to read the news. I don't know if you use them for that at all.
To be honest, when I look for it's normally things that it's normally specific stories that I'll look for, and I'll just like I'll end up Googling it.
Right.
I'll look at the news stories like that. Sometimes it's BBC, sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fair enough. It's because I kind of went into this thinking that actually I think that the BBC has fallen by the wayside to a certain extent about how impartial it is. Like I love the idea of having this unifying platform where people are able to air their views, and then they're able to get in someone that airs the opposite views and have these two people discuss it. But in the last couple of years, I've just kind of thought to myself, like, the stuff I'm reading on the website is definitely becoming more left. Look at it that way. It's becoming more like emotionally charged. It's becoming less dry. And I don't know. I first kind of thought this, and it was the back of my mind. So I was actually really, really interested in researching this when I started discussing this topic, thinking about whether the TV license is fair. Because when you think about it, if we're going to be paying, and we're going to be mandatorily, it's going to be mandatory to pay a company in order to just access TV. We want them to be unbiased. It's because otherwise we have this institution that's being paid by the taxpayers to produce an opinion. And if they were producing content that wasn't unbiased, then I think there would be a kind of a quandary there. So I basically started researching this a little bit, and it turns out there's lots and lots and lots of people out there that do think the BBC is no longer impartial, which was supposed to be their founding tenet, right? And I'm sure you've heard people say this as well. Like it's become quite a common thought process in recent years.
I think when I started realising it, and I think the only time that you would realise something like this is when the BBC is explicitly disagreeing with something that you think.
Right.
I think that you could actively watch the BBC, and if it was displaying the information in a biased manner in a way that you agree with, you would never think twice about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you would come to the realisation, and I think you've probably came to the realisation that it's biased because you've noticed it going towards the left, because I would say that you're slightly right of centre. Now, the time that I noticed it was when they were reporting on the independence referendum.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Scottish independence referendum, which was 8 years ago now. Wow, that's crazy. In that referendum, I voted yes. I wanted Scotland to be an independent country, and it was pretty clear to me, and I think it was quite a big thing for the Yes campaign, that the BBC were not for independence.
Without a doubt.
They were supposed to be an unbiased source, but you could see it in the reporting. Like if they reported on rallies for like the Yes campaign, the pictures would be framed in such a way that like you could see basically no one, so that it looked kind of empty. In reality, that wasn't the way it was, and you can see, I guess you understand why they would think that. Because if Scotland was to, chop off, however many homes there are in Scotland, they're all now not paying for a TV license. That's just a bunch of money that the BBC's just losing.
Yeah.
People will lose their jobs.
Well, I mean,
there'll be cuts there.
At the end of the day, the BBC Scotland is quite a large branch of the BBC, and that
Yeah.
I don't even know how that would work in terms of splitting that, and would they become a Scottish channel, or would they need to get bought over? I have no idea how that would.
I mean, BBC Scotland would have such a small revenue stream that it would probably be shit.
Sadly, yeah, it'd probably just die away. It's because you'd be no idea, there's no chance you'd probably be introducing a new law of another Scottish TV license. So
Yeah, when we're talking about how they're biased, though, my first initial thought was, surely the BBC wants to be aligned with the working class person in Britain.
right.
That's how they want to come across, right? Because that's the vast majority of people in Britain. So they want you to like what they're putting on so that you'll watch it, right?
Okay.
So in essence, it is becoming, it has an element of bias based on how it thinks or what it thinks the public wants to see. And I think right now the public fucking loves to see politicians being nailed to the cross. And they do that every fucking night on the news.
Well, you're completely wrong.
Oh.
Yeah. It turns out that the bias that the BBC is actually kind of moving further towards is what people are calling metropolitan left, and that's basically like the lefties in London. We can look at it that way. It's not the lefties that are in small minor villages in the north of England. It's left-leaning people that live in London, and they have like relatively forward-thinking, progressive views. But before, like, this is the bias that's generally understood by people to have. Like Boris Johnson, actually, he admitted this. Like, and he's like he's the PM, and he basically said that he was the one that used this phrase. Metropolitan man bias, which basically means that it's inclined towards this type of upper middle class professional person, and I was quite interested to hear this because I thought, like you said actually at the beginning of what you said there, I thought that I had noticed the difference in the BBC because I was moving further right, or at least I don't think I was moving further right, but I was just developing political thoughts. It was the first time I was thinking about things like the economy. It was the first time I was thinking about things like free rights and libertarianism versus socialism and these type of things. So I was really constructing these thoughts for the first time. We're only really the last couple of years, realistically. So I thought that's why I thought I would start to recognise bias in the BBC. But there's every year this company, which is called Ofcom, that is a British broadcast regulator. So a regulator in the UK that makes sure that TV channels are doing what they're supposed to do and comply with the law, basically. They for the last 3 years, 2017 to 2020, they have released pretty comprehensive reports on the state of the BBC, basically. And they touch upon the what's the word I'm looking for here? The impartiality, or more importantly, they touch upon the impression of impartiality. And I'll get into what I exactly mean by that. So I've got the report here, and in post-production, I'm sure we'll show you the report, and we'll kind of try to highlight the... That's on you, Scott.
And we'll have to do that. Thanks, Liz.
That's exactly right, and I'm going to make it difficult for you. So we're going to head to the page 6 of this Ofcom report. It's like 99 pages, so it's pretty extensive. And the first couple of pages is kind of give a general highlight of the report. They're basically saying that the BBC is continuing to broadly deliver in its remits, but there is an awareness of how the viewing habits of the general public are changing, and that's kind of what we mentioned at the start of the video. The idea is that this is no longer the same environment, and more people are moving away to alternative platforms, and the BBC needs to be aware of this and take some preemptive action, which is like totally in itself pretty fair. However, when we get to page 6 is when we start addressing the concept of impartiality in the BBC. And basically, I'll read out a little bit for you here, because I thought this was really, really interesting. In an increasingly polarised political and cultural landscape, ensuring due impartiality in news and current affairs remains critical, and it's an area that many feel strongly about, which is absolutely undoubtedly on these days. I think your perception and what you put out there in terms of political opinion is very closely paid attention to. During the year, we did not find that the BBC to have breached their impartiality or due accuracy requirements of the broadcasting code. However, our performance tracker shows that only 54% of adults perceive the BBC News as being impartial. So just over half of us only believe this is still an impartial news source. This is what people believe as well. I want to note it's not what people have found through rigorous study. And they note that the audience perceptions of impartiality are shaped by a range of factors which are not all directly related to the BBC News content. Research last year has found that people with strong political opinions generally saw the BBC as too left or right wing, depending on their personal political persuasion. Analysis of social media suggests that those with the strongest political views were the most likely to make critical comments about the BBC. So I was quite blown away when I read that, to be honest with you, because I thought that because I was forming maybe more right-ish. I mean, I say right, we're talking centre, right? I pick and choose. Most reasonable people pick and choose their policies and what they agree and disagree with. And I particularly when it comes to like free market trade and stuff like that, I'm kind of more right-leaning. So I thought that I was developing this bias, or I was identifying this bias because the BBC because I was just becoming aware of it. But what this study have actually found is that both the left and the right are now thinking that the BBC is less biased, and
more biased. You mean
more biased? Excuse me. Yeah. And so this was mind blowing to me. So what I'm kind of picking up from this directly is that this has to be a direct result of the polarized climate we're in right now. Right? It's like so many people are like closer to the edges of their side that they'll see news and they'll be like, that's just so impartial. That's not in the centre, and that's kind of like what we've touched on before about people losing sight of where the centre even is anymore, right?
Well, that was what I just touched on there when I said that you often realise or you think the BBC is biased when it suddenly disagrees with something that you say.
Right, exactly.
So when it came to the independence referendum, they didn't seem like they were portraying it fairly. So in that year, I thought the BBC were being biased. Now, it probably so happens that there were a few things that came up when you were developing your thoughts that the BBC disagreed with.
Right.
And it was probably because it was more left-leaning than you would have liked it to be, and then you started to think, well, this is a bit biased. People that are extremely left will think that their opinions are right, and when the BBC portrays, even if it portrayed a reasonable centre stance on something, that's too right for them, and people on the far right, if the BBC was to portray an impartial thought, a centre opinion, that's too left for them,
Yeah.
So I would understand why the more extreme your viewpoint was, the more likely you would think that it's biased against you, because it just gets further away from where you are, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
If the BBC was completely impartial, and it was in the centre, the people on the extremes are the furthest from that point, so they're the most likely to feel like the BBC is biased one way or the other, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it, and it totally tied into our discussion about kind of this the climate we're in right now, which is leading towards people becoming more and more radicalised and losing complete sight. And kind of what we said in that episode was that radicalisation is this inability to have a discussion. It's when you go so far to one side that you think that the other side is just like indiscussable. So like you even like looking at the middle, you see these policies and you totally become so trapped in your own echo chamber, and you form such strong polarized opinions that you kind of lose track of what you're even seeing anymore.
And these are the voices that you hear as well on the internet,
right?
And on,
exactly.
When you see these Twitter threads that I'm talking about in my topic just there, these are the radicalised people, I think, that are talking about this and are unable to have a discussion on matters.
Well, and that's what's quite interesting as well, because what kind of confused me at first was that I suppose that confused me at first. It's because when you do a little bit further reading of the report, and I'll direct us to a graph in a little second here, is that you start realising that I don't think the BBC is getting more biased, even though public opinion clearly believes it's getting more biased. But there's absolutely no doubt the BBC has always been biased. And this is exactly what we discussed when we were talking about like messaging. Everywhere is biased. At the end of the day, you cannot.
It's a private company.
Yeah, they cannot not be. Well, I mean, yeah. Yeah, it's a private company, but it's paid with taxpayer fucking money. So that's the gripe that people have, right? Is that 50% disagree with them being biased in the direction they're biased for, right?
Yeah, I think one of two things is happening. Either the BBC is getting more bias, but it can't be getting more bias in both directions.
Right.
So it must be the people that are actually going further in their own directions, and they're thinking the BBC's moving, when in actual fact it's them that's moving.
Right, exactly, and it's so weird. It's because like in Ofcom, in its Ofcom website, if we can go down to the graph at the top of page 32, I don't know if you have that on your screen as well. It basically shows opinion of whether the BBC is impartial or not, and you can see this is just like a useful infographic for what I'm going to move on to. You can see that in recent years, the BBC over from 2017 to 2018, we've like continuously become less, perceived to be impartial. Like people think it's getting worse and worse and worse, and currently in the UK, unbelievably, of all of our top 5 broadcasting channels, the BBC is actually considered to be the least partial by public opinion now. Purely by public opinion, which is just so mind-boggling to me. It's because like the sole tenet of this organisation from day one has been to remain impartial, and whether it's through fault of their own or not, they're now completely and utterly losing that perception in the eyes of the audience. Like, 42% of people think that the BBC are telling a one-sided story now, and I do have some other data which is pretty interesting, but at the end of the day it is from a think tank which is admittedly for free market trade, and free market trade is the opposite of what BBC want. They don't want a free market. They want to be in the position that they're currently in. I can talk about the free market in a little bit, but basically a couple of stats here which will have some amount of cherry picking in it, I've absolutely no doubt, but kind of proves the bias of the BBC, because this study was carried out from 2004 to 2015. So it went over quite a long time. Okay. Of the 4,000 guests that were actually brought on to discuss Brexit on like the BBC News show, only 3% of them actually explicitly supported Brexit, and the rest of them either explicitly supported keeping the union, or they just didn't express opinions one way or the other. So there's a clear divide in the number of people that are representing this opinion. It's supposed to be impartial, so you'd like to think it'd be 50-50%. So that's obviously an example of biased behaviour. Another one,
so it's probably worth noting that the UK voted to leave the EU as well,
right?
Which means that the majority of people want to leave the EU. So all of those people are going to realise that the BBC are just bringing on guests that don't want to leave the union.
Yeah, and just before the show, we had like a brief discussion about why it makes so much sense for the BBC to want that opinion. It's because at the end of the day, like, it's actually no. I don't think it's much different from the argument that they weren't too fond of the Scottish referendum, because for the end of the day, they want there to be unity. They are highly aligned with the British government, and the British government is well aware of. Well, I don't know how many people were aware of anything to do with Brexit, and I don't really want to get into it right now either. But the government's clear stance was that they didn't want Brexit to happen anyway. People fucking voted for it anyway though. So there was like clear bias in the show. There's this additional, like at the end of some BBC shows, they have something called the BBC Thought of the Day, and for concerning economics, business, and finance. Of 100% of these thought of the day discussions, 65% of them were negative of capitalism. Only 8% of them were positive, and the rest of them were neutral. So there's a huge leaning towards socialism, effectively, or like breaking down free market, or like reducing the extent of free market trade. So like they clearly have these biases, and they've always been there, because these things go. This study goes back all the way to 2004. This is not something that's just happened in this newly political climate we find ourselves in. It's always been there. I think this kind of just reinforces the fact that people are only really becoming aware of it, or it's becoming more of an issue in the modern days, because it seems that like way back when, back to 2004 or whatever, people didn't care, or they weren't politically switched on to the fact that bias was such a thing as it was. I can only presume, and that's why in recent years they're seeing this backlash from their viewers.
I would think that in 2004, the percentage of people that got their news or their information directly from the BBC was vastly higher than it is now.
Yeah.
So the BBC is now becoming diluted into a pool of sources, into a pool of, you know, people are watching Netflix instead. They're getting their news on Sky. They're getting their educational information, somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things are becoming more abundantly available, so people are probably wisening up to the fact that the BBC are impartial. Like in this, the figure that you showed there on page, was it 32 or something like that? People are actually saying that Sky News are the most impartial now.
Yeah.
And it's probably just because there are more news sources now than there have been. People might be watching multiple of them, and they're saying, Sky seem to be reporting this well, and the BBC definitely are not.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I didn't really. As I said, I don't watch Sky News. I actually don't know anything about them, so I didn't comment on them because I didn't know. I have absolutely no idea of what their general impartiality is, to be honest with you. But
people think it's good.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, people seem to think that. To go to another thing which I thought was really, really interesting in my research here, which is goes all the way back to what your initial hypothesis was, that they probably cater to more working class people. See, if you go to page 35 on that document as well, there's another interesting table here, which I'll kind of describe to the viewers, because I won't have a mouse to gesticulate what I'm talking about here. So down the left-hand side, you have questions that were asked to an audience of people, and in the pink, you have the number of people that were asked this question. So the questions are, do you believe that news coverage helps me understand what's happening in the world today? Do you believe that the news represents a range of viewpoints? And do you believe that the news is impartial? And we have answers about whether they agree with this or not. And it's split into two socioeconomic groups. The first three columns is the AB socioeconomic group, which I had to research what this was. This basically means professionals, middle class people. And DE socioeconomic group is working class. That's people that like work, not work trades, but work like lower labour like that. And this is what's really interesting about this is that, you see that all the way from like 2018 to 2020, it's consistently the working class. They think that the BBC do a worse job of providing information. You find that they do a worse job of providing varied viewpoints, and also that they're less partial. So clearly, it's like the problem they have is that they're appealing to the middle class, ironically, which I think comes from this like London-centric point of view that England tends to have, that we are not super aware of in Scotland, because we're so fucking far out the way that like no one thinks about us. But I think there's quite a lot of sentiment in like particularly the north of England, that all the resources just get pulled towards people that live in London. People that live in London tend to live like, or at least the classic London ideas, that they like have the higher professional grade jobs and basically have a higher degree of success than people that live in smaller towns that have been neglected by the government.
Yeah, I think that's like the London effect, isn't it? The London effect is like everything for some reason costs a lot more, everyone gets paid a lot more, so they seem to make more money, stuff like that.
Yeah,
considered the sort of upper middle class, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And the majority of people that work at the BBC probably work in London, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Yeah, that's where their head offices are.
So their think tanks are probably coming directly from London. So I guess it doesn't make sense in terms of them being like sticking to their tenets and making people like happy with their content.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes sense that people in London are more agreeing with them, and people out with London are starting to say that like these guys aren't actually doing a good job, because everyone that works there lives in London. Right,
exactly. So that's what's quite interesting about this, is like when we see in the 2020 for the impartiality statements, like we have a 11% difference between this like working class compared to the middle class group, which is like fascinating on its own. But what also kind of reinforces the previous point about the environment having a huge effect on people's opinions is that both upper class and not upper class, middle class and working class people over the years are having a deteriorating opinion of the impartiality. It's consistently going down across both the groups, which kind of like, when you like take all this information together, I think it became clear to me that the BBC clearly has always had this kind of implicit bias. It's always been there. It's that we're now in this environment where it's starting to really really affect them, and people becoming more aware of it. And what in this report by Ofcom, it basically implied that as much as like impartiality is an extremely complex issue, it's now starting to affect the BBC, and they're starting to people are starting to like go against them because of this, and part of this comes against like the idea of like decriminalising the TV license or coming up with alternative licenses, because why would we want to pay for a service that so many people in the country think it does not represent their opinions? And that's the point. Like they're able to very successfully identify like cultures, socioeconomic incomes and type of thing, at least to our opinion. There's a graph in here which says that the different people are happy to different extents about their representation in terms of diversity, but clearly the diversity of thought is not there according to most people. So another interesting one. I like we said at the start of this conversation, I thought it was going to be that the BBC have bias, full stop, and that's why people are getting more annoyed at it. But it seems like it's a little bit more nuanced by that, and they're being disproportionately affected by the changing landscape. So in terms of talking about of balancing the pros and cons, there's only one real other con that I think that I can. Well, actually, there's another pro that I can tag on at the end, but there's another main con that I think is a result of the BBC, and that is the fact that inherently, it's just like it makes sense to me that it must stifle competition, right? Like we mentioned about how the BBC, they know their budget at the end of the day, they know how many people are consistently going to pay for it, and they know that in order to get access to other channels, people are going to be paying them. This must mean that we're working in an environment where for private companies, it's got to be hard to try and tackle the BBC. Like particularly, like it's I think it's more obvious in the radio shows in the UK actually, because as I said, there are 60 radio shows in the UK approximately, and many of these cover like local areas. We have a couple that are like international, but basically I can't remember who said it, but I heard someone say like to start in the UK, to start like a talking radio show, like it's just like you're going to die a death. You're never going to have the viewership because you will always be competing against the BBC, which at the end of the day they do not need to fight for their funding. They are just going to have it, and they're not going to stop their services, and they're not going to adapt to any sort of competitive free market in that regard, because that need isn't there. So there must be some extent of stagnation that we're seeing because this free market isn't allowed to flourish, at least from my opinion, from my perspective.
Yeah, it does seem like, from what we spoke about, that the BBC seems, it has its own brand of corruption, but it seems to be a lesser brand of corruption than ones that we've referenced before. Like, so it does seem to have this internal bias, and it definitely wants you to think something, but it seems quite strange to me that the BBC isn't impartial. It still seems to have an opinion on everything, and it's because its business model sort of relies on it. But surely in all markets there should be a news source, there should be a source somewhere that is impartial. It just seems really strange to me that we have the BBC, and it almost seems like they're worried that one day the BBC won't be there, so they're trying to like convince you that the method in which they exist is the one to adhere to. So it's talking about how they move towards socialism and away from capitalism because it's not the market they operate in. But wasn't the BBC created because that was the case? The BBC was created because it didn't exist in that atmosphere, and that's why it exists.
Well,
so
it's a bit of a mindfuck in a way, and it's a problem, and that's basically what the government was trying to address. Is that, and I think it all comes down to this pricing model, the fact that people are, they've got their hand behind their back, making them pay for it, and the views of the BBC, they're like quite closely intertwined with the government, and it's kind of they are influenced by their pricing model at the end of the day. So there's basically been like talks of like trying to reform it, trying to come up with a new method of selling the BBC, and this was basically what the government threw up its hands and said, we can't fucking do it, and we're going to need to wait until 2027 because we didn't manage it. It's because what they wanted, the initial plan was just to move towards a subscription model, which makes, I think, a lot of sense. The idea is that if you wanted to watch BBC News, you'd pay for BBC News. If you didn't want BBC One, you wouldn't pay for BBC One, something like that. Or you would just like pay a general subscription for the year, and like the TV license would be free, and you could watch TV channels. And in that, and if that is the case, then it would become competitive, but they'd still be getting their money not through advertisement. I guess it would be like Netflix in that way, right? Because
yeah, but it would become a subscription service, and then people wouldn't pay for it because it's shit, and then you wouldn't get your news. Like I think that would effectively mean the death of the BBC. You know, not the entire corporation, but perhaps of like BBC One, BBC Two, for example. You know, if they were to all of a sudden say, okay, you now pay a subscription for each of the, like, your TV license is now made up of 40 subscriptions, and you can click out of some of them and you can click on to some of them.
Some would naturally die, yeah.
Some would die off, and as people less and less trust BBC News, they will eventually click off of that as well, because there are so many sources out there today in which you can get your news. So I agree that they have to update their model. I think it's going to be tough, but they have to do it in a way that still means people receive an impartial news source, which
it's hard. It's not easy at all. And like I guess now that you're saying it out loud, the concept of like a pick and choose subscription model just doesn't work in that regard. It's because it would inevitably lead to certain divisions like atrophying and dying. But I think in the BBC they have to trim the fat now. I think the BBC's it's gotten very large, and just due to the current pricing model we have, some parts of it are stagnated. There has to be some shows that the BBC produced, and they fucking know no one's going to watch it. You know, like, I'm sure there's an audience for like Countryfile and stuff like that. But see, like the daytime crap, like, people working on these shows must know that this would never make money if it wasn't for the BBC, right? And I don't know, in my opinion, I think that might not necessarily be a bad thing. Like, do we really need a local radio station for every county in the UK? Could we not trim some of that? And if that was the case, then we'd have less costs, and the subscription model would I think it would be able to sustain itself if they did just trim a lot of the fat and tighten up the services, try and be a little bit more competitive, because they've been moving towards this competitive market. I agree though, like I would, the last thing I want to happen is for the BBC to try to lose the sense of impartiality that it has right now, and the sense of fairness, and I would hate to find out that any of the learning resources are getting cut because those don't make money in the short term, because we're talking about gains that are only going to be 20 years down the line until people get a job and that type of thing. That it's a scary one, because it's like, once you make that decision, you can't undo it. You know, the BBC could be gone if you choose to upset the model drastically. And I think that would be, I genuinely do think that would be a huge loss for the country if it did die.
Yeah, now that you've highlighted the areas in which we all use the BBC that I never really thought of before, I can see how it would be a loss. I just don't think the TV license itself is like a really outdated model of payment, and they have to put something new on the table. Now, I don't know whether that is, you know, maybe they just say, you know, we're scrapping the TV license, but we're adding this into some other form of tax. You know, we're putting it somewhere else. So it'd be like, we're putting it in a place where we can't say no to it because we need it, kind of thing. Like a country like Britain, and, you know, especially a country like America, needs an impartial news source. You know, we know America doesn't have it, but there are 300, like, once a country gets so big, there are like 300 million people in America, and there's no impartial news source that exists. These people are just like stuck in echo chambers,
right?
And that's why they're all so radical. That's why America is like such a polarized country. Like, Britain does have one of these things, and maybe it's getting to the point where Britain is getting, you know, it's getting to the point where it's so big now that it is losing this. But I think it is essential, you're right, but it's also important that news source isn't inherently corrupt. You know, it has to serve the purpose that it sets out in its tenets, And the only way to do that would be to make it so that the BBC is constant every year. Like, the only way to make something not corrupt is to be like, this is what you're getting every year,
Okay.
and it's not going to change. Like, there's no monetary incentive for you to be corrupt. That this is just a
Right.
pure, and it should be the same for, like, politicians, and it should be the same for anybody that acts in, like, service of the country. It should
Right.
be like a bog standard, like, you get this, and nothing is going to change that, because if anything can influence that, it will influence it, and it will inherently lead to corruption.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that the BBC doesn't want to exist in this capitalist market because it thinks it needs to survive in, like, a socialist environment to survive, we have to get that out of the way of thinking. Like, if we just remove the corruption at, like, a base level and be like, the BBC, it's now in, like, your national insurance. It's now part of what you pay to live in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is, like, it's £100 a year. Like,
160. Mm-hmm.
160. It's not that much money, but, like, I feel like if it was somewhere else and it was like, okay, we have to pay for this, it's going to be this thing, nothing is going to affect the amount of money it gets, then there's no need for it to be corrupt.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting idea, actually. I think one thing I should have mentioned this at the beginning because it's quite important. But the TV tax, which is what some people call it, a TV license, it disproportionately affects the poor. That's one thing that we want to address. I should have addressed from the beginning, was that this is effectively a tax because everyone needs to pay for it because you can't do without the TV. Like, realistically, most people, especially older people, they're always going to pay that. They're not going to stop paying it, and lower income households, they are more severely affected by having to pay for that entry buyer than people in more middle class households. So that's kind of another anachronism of this law, that we're affecting the people that shouldn't be affected by this. So that's another, like, anachronism of the law. I think of the TV license that exists. Which is kind of, I should have mentioned that previously, but that's almost by the by at this stage. It's just because you mentioned about how it's not a huge amount of money. For some households it probably is a lot of money, and if you were to just tag that on as tax, there'd probably be a lot of outcry as a result of that. But
there's no reason for it to be a standard tax. It could be like a distributive tax where, like, the rich pay a bit more,
yeah,
the poor pay a bit less.
yeah, that wouldn't be a bad idea. But because I agree with you, it would need to be some type of this type of scheme where they're given a pot of money, and it's like, you make that go as far as you want to. If you cannot make it go, if you need more money than this, you need to fucking do something about it. Like for instance, the thing that a lot of people talk about that I kind of agree with, actually, is that, like, the BBC has so many talent that, like, they're charged, like, they're paid like £1 million a year. It's like, do we need that from a broadcasting company that's being paid by the taxpayers? Do we want to be paying people that much money? I understand that we want to have, like, critically acclaimed shows, but why not make this a space for up and coming actors to? That's what the BBC used to be. It used to be a platform for people to bounce into the actual acting world. So, like, we've got so much. I think there's so much, like, dead weight in the BBC right now that some sort of reform or, like, moving to a different type of service could be cut, and it's just the really, really hard part would be balancing the bits that we want to keep and the bits we wouldn't really mind getting rid of. It's because, yeah, like, some of the salaries are kind of stupid, but at the end of the day they do produce a lot of these really, really critically acclaimed shows, like we mentioned earlier on, which will have an effect on the British culture. So it's a really, really nuanced issue, actually, and I knew coming into this that we weren't going to say, like, yeah, abolish the BBC. It's because, like, there are people out there that are staunchly of that opinion, which I think is just so short-sighted when you think about the amount of reach the BBC has, not only across the world but particularly in the UK. Like, it's hard to avoid the BBC. It's so much part of what we encounter every day and how our opinions are formed, and it represents our country in a pretty positive way. So I think it would be horrific if we made any decisions that endangered that, but I do agree there has to be changes. It's because the way that this law is currently being implemented is just so old-fashioned.
Yeah, I guess if the government are smart enough, they'll move away from this kind of subscription model, and they'll make it some sort of equal payment that gets made every year. Like, each household if they were to pay a TV license, how much money would that be?
Yeah.
That's the money in the pot, like, and now we get that money from somewhere else, maybe a distributive tax throughout households or something like that. You know, every household that has a TV pays a proportionate amount on tax based on the income that household has, something
Right.
like that, some kind of distributive tax to keep the service in line, and that would inherently make it so that the BBC wasn't under threat. If we were to move into a more free market, we could be like, no, we want to keep the BBC. That's a particularly British part of it's part of the British culture. You know, we need to keep that, and we need to have it be impartial and available to everyone at a fair price point.
Yeah, I really do hope that, as you said, the politicians are smart enough and try and have a really, really think about the ramifications of moving away from this model where the BBC is allowed to be impartial. Is because the reason that they basically didn't come to a decision just recently about how to implement this, that they were actually moving towards a subscription model, but the idea was that there's 2 million households in the UK that don't have access to broadband, and they're obviously all like older people, so they couldn't move the BBC because that they don't have the infrastructure. Apparently part of the reason why we've been pushing for every household to have the internet is so that we can transition the BBC into a different format. But after this conversation, I'm thinking that has too many risks in terms of introducing the need for competition in the BBC, which I had not thought about before at all, actually. So yeah, it's a little bit more in depth than I first realised, and I hope, as I said, they've got 5 years to decide. It's 2027 is when we need to make the next decision, and by then, undoubtedly, I would have thought pretty much every home will have the internet, so I'll be curious to see how the discussions resume then.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point to end on for this week. So that has been episode 4 of Guide to the 21st Century. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, if you guys have listened to the conversations and you do want to add a comment, please keep the conversation going. If you have a view, or if you think we were wrong in something we've said, or if you've got evidence that we were wrong in something we'd said, or you just want to add to the discussion, please do put a comment on the YouTube video. And like we say, we do want to try and address those in following weeks if we get enough that are sort of conversationally inducing.
So there. Okay, guys, we'll see you next week where we'll have more topics for you, more discussion.